Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am a professor of medicine and medical education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Director of Simulation and Patient Safety. I would like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, we plan to highlight Chapter 17 on mastery learning, milestones, and entrustable professional activities within our book called Comprehensive Healthcare Simulation, Mastery Learning, and Health Professions Education. Today, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. Eric Holmboe, who is an adjunct professor of medical education at the Feinberg School of Medicine and the Chief Research, Milestone Development, and Evaluation Officer at the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, otherwise known as the ACGME. Eric, it's an honor to interview you today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, I know that we've talked in the past about your background and how you've gotten involved in the ACGME, but can you tell our listeners a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, I think, in all honesty, it started with being a training officer in the U.S. Navy and a associate program director where, like I'm sure many of your listeners, I went through site visits and had to go through accreditation. But probably more pertinent to this is I had the good fortune to be part of what was called the Portfolio Project back when the general competencies were just about to be released, working with a group at the American Board of Internal Medicine to create essentially a toolkit to help with the implementation of the original general competencies when I was an associate program director at Yale. We're now 20 years into this evolution. So the 6 general competencies, which you love and know, I'm sure, are patient care and procedural skills, medical knowledge, professionalism, interpersonal skills and communication, practice-based learning and improvement, and systems-based practice were all launched officially in July of 2001.
Wow, so they even affected me as a resident and I didn't even know it.
Well, that may be part of the problem that we're still having, right? Is they did have trouble kind of getting implemented and, if you will, kind of reaching down into the residents themselves.
Interesting. Well, I know you were a key player in exploring the use of milestones for these residency competencies. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the Milestones project and how you got involved and how they were developed?
Yeah, I think you're being way too kind, but in all honesty, during these early phases of kind of implementing the general competencies, it was clear it was a struggle. Part of it was that folks were struggling around curricular changes that really were needed or needed better assessments. And so there's an ongoing conversation that there also just was a lack of understanding, particularly in, quote, the newer competencies of practice-based learning and systems-based practice. During that time, I joined the ABIM, and then there was a group called the Quadrads. These were where the Program Director Society, the American Council of Physicians, the Certification Board, and the ACGME got together within specialties to try to move this forward. And so we did write kind of a paper that ended up in the American Journal of Medicine to try to guide some systems thinking, if you will, in the implementation. But it still remained a struggle. And to be perfectly honest, milestones, there's nothing new about the concept. And it literally led to a conversation with Dr. Tom Naska, who at that time was the dean at Thomas Jefferson University, but who had been selected as the next CEO of the ACGME. And it was a what-if conversation that ultimately led to a similar what-if conference in Philadelphia, believe it or not, November of 2007, where we explored with the internal medicine community, what if we tried milestones to create a shared language and to make that language developmental? And so, was the community interested in exploring that? One other really important piece of history here, and people may not recognize, but Hubert and Stuart Dreyfus of the Dreyfus Stage Model Development were consultants to the group that developed the general competencies and are actually co-authors on a 2002 Health Affairs paper. The competencies were always intended to be implemented using a developmental mindset with expertise, or in your world, Jeff, with the wonderful work you've done, mastery in mind. And so when the group got together in Philadelphia in 2007, the goal wasn't to set the floor, but to think about, can we create a developmental language toward at least proficiency and expertise? So that was the beginning. At the same time, there was also work beginning in peds and general surgery around similar concepts. But ultimately, we published an initial draft. It was way too detailed, granular. We're internists. But it was a helpful exercise. It was done interprofessionally. We had residents as part of the working groups, and some programs did try them out in their training programs. But that initial experience led the ACGME, when they implemented the next accreditation system in 2012, to include Milestones as part of the new system. So that's the history.
So when you developed the Milestones, it was a roadmap in essence to how to grade levels of competency for residents, correct?
It was definitely a developmental roadmap, but it was more than just providing, quote, a grade. We were hoping to get away from always thinking in high stakes term and think more formatively. And so we wanted to give folks a kind of language to see what their journey would look like, not only for the faculty and the programs, but for residents too. That's why residents were part of that initial, working group, because they're one of the key stakeholders, so that they could use that for their own personal development. In fact, if you read the program requirements, individualized learning plans are a program requirement that is supposed to be completed and discussed every 6 months. Now, we know that has not been achieved, but it was really, meant to help them as much as it was the programs.
Yeah, and I'm a part of those evaluations every 6 months, which we do at Northwestern for our internal medicine residents. I'm often struck because our end of rotation evaluations use the milestone framework. And I'm often most struck by how sometimes first year intern level at the very beginning of the residency program are getting ready for independent practice marks. So I think that at least as an institution, we could do better at our inter-rater reliability and helping people understand what the milestones mean, because it's certainly not formative if you're an intern and you're getting ready for independent practice.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in what you just shared, Jeff. It's such an important set of points. It is really difficult to move away from that kind of rating scale, mindset where we're always worried about giving a low mark, right? I mean, if you look, for example, in previous versions of kind of rating forms in internal medicine, like the mini clinical evaluation exercise with the 1 to 9 scale, everybody's between a 6 and a 9. And I don't know what that means. Everybody's superior. Okay, compared to what? Milestones were also an attempt, and it's still a ways to go. And again, this is something you know better than anybody, to be more criterion reference, which is the whole philosophy behind mastery-based learning. It was to get out of this kind of normative, range restriction, halo effect type problem. And yet when faculty use it, if they don't understand its purpose, what they're going to do is look at the number first and not worry about the description. The way we've tried to get people to approach it is look at the description first, assign the code last. In fact, we've completely redesigned our direct observation forms. That's the sequence. The very last thing you do is, provide a code, because that number is nothing more than a code. You and I both know that. And if that code is not attached to something that's actually meaningful and accurate, well, then it doesn't provide much value.
Yeah, it makes me want to actually take the numbers out of our evaluation forms altogether and just circle the words.
Yeah, and some people have done that, by the way, with better success. They say just simply choose the vignette, the description in the column that best meets your trainee. And if it looks like they, are kind of in transition, a little bit of this and a little bit of that between two columns, pick the one in between, and just circle. That's really the way the tool is supposed to be used. But again, habits are tough to break.
And it goes the other way too, I think, because it's one thing for the faculty to figure out how to market, but also the interns, the residents, when they get a 3 as an intern, they feel sometimes because it's a 3 out of 9 that they're somehow performing under par when in fact they're right where they should be.
Yeah, again, another tremendous shift that's needed in mindset. as I remind faculty, you have to always keep, recognize that these folks have spent all their years prior to getting to you in residency being hammered to perform, to get the grades, right? Whether it was in high school to get into college into medical school, now to get into the residency of choice. It's that kind of fixed or performance mindset. That's just what they've been socialized into. Then they come into residency and we go like, oh, you know what? You can let all that go now. It's all about growth mindset. We just want you to be your best self. And of course, they're thinking in the back of their mind, yeah, right, cut me a break. All of a sudden you're telling me it's okay to get a 3 after I've just spent 16 years getting hammered, in an education system that really values grades. That's a huge shift for them. And so we have to help them do that and get away from those numbers and really, help them get better. I mean, I know this is also about mastery-based learning. One of the things I love about the mindset, and Bill McGahey, taught me this over and over, that you make the assumption everybody can achieve mastery. If they put in the right, work, if you give them the right type of training and the right kind of assessment, almost everybody can get there. That's a wonderful operating assumption. And that's what we hope that's kind of the operating assumption of the milestones. But when you give everybody a 4 in the first 6 months of training, it kind of undermines the process.
Right. And you alluded to a little bit about the mindset in undergraduate medical education, where it's very much grade-based and there's a lot of pressure to perform and get the highest grades so you can get in the best residency. And that's a perfect segue into almost the equivalent undergraduate medical education use of a milestone, but they call it the Entrustable Professional Activity, or EPA. Right. Can you tell me a little bit about the EPAs and how they're similar and different to the milestones?
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference, I'll just start with, that milestones are nothing more than a developmental narrative description of the competencies. That's it. Competencies, when you hear that with the, when it ends in a Y, means ability. What's the ability of the individual? So it's really about individual ability. Entrustable professional activities, the name applies, is about the activity, it's the thing you do. So it's really focused on execution of an activity. But I'm sure your listeners will quickly recognize, well, there's a lot of overlap. If I'm going to judge somebody's ability, I got to watch him do stuff, right? So you can see where the two come together. EPAs were originally developed by Ola Tenkate and his colleagues to function on activities that professionals do that integrates multiple competencies necessary for that task or activity. That's the goal. So they tend to be a bit more holistic when they're used more for graduate medical education or the practicing physician. I think what the core EPAs for undergraduate medical education, which are unique to the United States, by the way, is to take what I would call these foundational skills that are described mostly in generic terms. In other words, they don't have the specialty context embedded in them, to make sure that the students are developing these foundational skills prior to entering residency. And so, for example, one of them is taking a history and physical. Well, that's a competency in the milestones framework. And then it would be rolled up into an activity such as, for you and I, caring for patients with chronic illness or taking care of somebody who has an acute illness. So you can see they're very different in the sense that we would roll up multiple competencies for an activity for us that's really more focused on kind of populations of patients we care for, or perhaps, a procedure, thinking of that as an episode of care. So there are a little bit of distinctions about how an EPA is used in the States for undergraduate versus what EPAs are typically used globally within a graduate medical education or other health professions context.
So why don't we have one terminology? Because I think it really confuses us practitioners out there that have to fill out these forms for both students and for residents.
Yeah, and I think it's a really fair question. From my perspective, really the most important, if you will, foundational unit for all of this are, in fact, the competency frameworks. You can call them something else if you wish, but you have to know what the kind of core set of abilities are for a profession. And I think what the general competencies for us have done is called out things we should have been paying attention to, but weren't. I'm not saying we're doing it well or it's easy, but I'd argue that quality and safety, care,